Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Star Wars Empire at War for PC and Mac. This is a real-time strategy game developed by Petroglyph Games and published by LucasArts in February of 2006 for Windows and later on for Mac. And it's interesting for a few reasons, the first of which being that it's simply a rarity. I mean, we don't get very many Star Wars strategy games. In fact, this is only one of 4. And the next reason being it's Petroglyph's first game. The studio was actually founded by a bunch of veterans of Westwood, so these are people who had worked on Command & Conquer and Dune 2 and such like that. And so they definitely knew what they were doing, but this was still their first game, their trial by fire, so to speak. And it was generally pretty well received. I mean, not amazingly well so, but generally pretty well received, and they would go on to make other games like, of course, Universe at War, Grey Goo as they're known for now, but this is the one that has really stuck. This is the one that people remember Petroglyph for the most part. So, that begs the question, how is this as a strategy game, and how is it as a piece of Star Wars media? Well, as far as presentation goes, this is a 3D real-time strategy game played from an isometric perspective, and it does have one kind of neat feature that I will go into in a moment, but suffice to say, the game does look dated by today's standards. It came out in 2006, it's a 3D game, what do you expect? But despite it looking somewhat dated by today's standards, it still looks alright, and that's partly because it looked alright in its time. It never was much of a looker other than just being very stylistically Star Wars, but at the same time, it was never bad looking either. It was just kind of middle of the road, and that still kind of persists to this day. It's not very visually impressive, but it definitely gets the Star Wars look and feel down. And that's really its major saving grace. It's that Star Wars styling that is both in the visuals and in the sound design. In addition to everything pretty much looking as it should if you are a fan of the Star Wars series and you know a fair amount about the ships and the units and things like that, it also sounds the part. You've got a lot of sound effects that definitely feel like they're just straight from the movies.
Affirmative. Resume march.
You've got a lot of the John Williams score, although some of the extra music was done by Frank Klepacki, which is kind of cool. And the voice acting at least attempts to sound like the various characters as we know them from the movies, even if the actual voice actors are not the original actors or anything like that. So they've done a very good job making it feel like Star Wars. It's just that it's kind of dated by today's standards in terms of its visuals, so it's just not quite a looker anymore. And even back in its day, it wasn't much of a looker, it just was Star Wars, and that's ultimately what really matters with the presentation. They nailed that bit, and it gives it a lot of charm as a result. But ultimately what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is set in the time period leading up to A New Hope, where you play as either the Rebel Alliance or the Galactic Empire, and it's all leading up to the climactic Battle of Yavin. And more specifically, depending on which faction you're playing, you're going to be ultimately pursuing different goals. For example, the Rebel Alliance is basically arming up to actually take on the Empire by trying to get the X-Wing fighter and all sorts of other things like that, liberate Kashyyyk, eventually they'll try to defeat the Empire at Yavin. And the Empire, on the other hand, is trying to, of course, suppress the rebels, but they are also looking deliberately for the traitor that passed the plans of the Death Star over to the rebels, and you eventually end up having to go through bits where you're trying to just completely crush the rebellion in pretty much the events of New Hope. But the problem is when you're going through the actual main campaigns that give you these storylines, you're going to find that it's really just not all that interesting. You're basically playing through the Galactic Civil War and not much else. So what's really the point of having much of a plot when you can literally just hop in the Galactic Conquest mode and you're playing through the just plain old Galactic Civil War? There's no story to it. You're just actually playing out the war. What's the point of going through the actual story campaigns when they don't really have anything to offer when you can just hop into the Galactic Conquest? there really isn't that much of a point. I mean, it's not like you're running into a bunch of really interesting, compelling characters that are going to drag you through the story. It's not like you're running into a lot of really great story moments. I mean, they're serviceable at best, but nothing particularly interesting. And generally speaking, the campaigns themselves are fairly underwhelming as far as strategy game campaigns go. But worse than that, the campaigns themselves don't really add all that much to Star Wars lore. It's really just more of a regurgitation of things we've already seen before. And when it throws in things we haven't seen before, they aren't things that we necessarily wanted to see. Did we really need to know how the Rebel Alliance got X-Wing fighters? Not really. I mean, your brain just filled in the gaps when you were watching the movies. You didn't necessarily need to know how the Rebels got their fighters, because you could just assume they either bought them on the black market, they stole them, they liberated them from garrisons, any number of things like that. And that sort of problem plagues the campaigns in general. They just aren't that interesting to play through. And if you want to play through the campaigns, you might as well just play the Galactic Conquest mode, because it doesn't really throw any story elements at you. You're just fighting for total dominance of the galaxy. And it gives you a few objectives to go through in order to actually be able to achieve that total dominance. And that's the thing. This game feels like it's wrapped up more in its mechanics than in its actual writing, which is not necessarily a bad thing, don't get me wrong. I mean, it is a real-time strategy game. I don't really expect the writing to be particularly amazing or anything like that, but it would have been nice if they had actually put an effort in to really expand the Star Wars lore as much as they could, instead of just kind of throwing together campaigns that don't really interest the player all that much and don't really add anything to the Star Wars lore. Certainly nothing that we really needed to see. Now that that's out of the way, let's talk about the actual gameplay itself. You have a campaign map of the galaxy where you can send your units all over the place from system to system, and you can, when you capture a system, build up certain structures within that system, such as a barracks or a mining complex or things like that, that will give you different abilities. Some of them just give you the ability to produce certain types of units. Others give you certain bonuses like additional credits, which is the in-game currency. And you use all that to produce various kinds of units, from just land units, your basic infantry, to tanks, to walkers if you're the Empire, to spaceships and starfighters and such like that, all of which will allow you to just straight up conquer your opponent. But there's more to it than simply building up units and sending them out to crush things. You see, the two factions actually play out pretty differently. The Empire generally has weaker units overall, except for their capital ships, which are ridiculously powerful, but they get more of those units, and they also have the advantage in terms of tech, so they can get things like AT-ATs pretty quickly and use those to just completely dominate the course of the game until the rebels somehow manage to catch up with them. And that pretty much defines your play experience if you're going to be the Empire. You have to be aggressive and domineering, and you have to do everything in your power to just completely and utterly crush the rebellion, whereas the rebels themselves have to play things a bit more sneakily. They have a disadvantage in terms of tech, so they actually have to go out and steal technology from the Empire with special units. In addition to going about their normal, well, we capture planets, we can build structures on those planets in order to get production up and such like that, but they can also augment that with things like siphoning credits from your foes, which is kind of neat. And you can also send in raiding parties that are smaller groups of units that actually bypass enemy fleets in orbit. Now, they don't get reinforcements, so you have to be very careful about what planets you pick and choose for those raiding parties, but it is a decidedly different style of play. You have to be a lot sneakier, you have to be a lot more clever with how you actually go about things if you are the Rebel Alliance. Whereas the Empire just kind of relies on overwhelming force, the Rebels have to actually be a lot more strategic about things. And right off the bat, this campaign structure definitely feels radically different than what we're used to with most strategy games. But there is one fairly big issue that this game has with regards to its actual gameplay structure, and that's that while it is unique, at least in the overall spectrum, there is one half, roughly, of the game that is just mind-numbingly boring. and that is the land battles, which are just incredibly tedious. You have groups of units that will go together and try to capture the maps, and you can build certain structures on these maps depending on whether you're defending or on offense, which will assist you in different ways. For example, a defender is going to pretty easily be able to put up a bunch of turrets that will make short work of a lot of the enemies, whereas the attacking party will have to first destroy those turrets and then build something else on top of that particular platform. So they can build things like Bacta tanks that will actually heal their units nearby. They can build turrets of their own to some degree, and those turrets can be pretty annoying to deal with sometimes, so you do have to keep an eye on these various platforms scattered throughout the map that you can actually build things on. You also need to keep an eye on the reinforcement points that will allow the player that actually holds that point to bring in reinforcements and thus basically overwhelm the opponent, normally the attackers. But here's the problem. The battles just drag on and on and on, and it's just this really basic rock, paper, scissors style of RTS, at least on the ground. Less so in space, but on the ground, it's just a set of rock, paper, scissors. Some units are much better against infantry, others are much better against certain types of vehicles, and it makes the actual on-the-ground strategy incredibly simplistic as a result. And in general, the strategy itself is pretty simplistic, even when you're in space. The difference is that in space, you have these really cool fighters going all over the place, you have a lot of stuff happening, and obviously we don't really get space battles all that much in strategy games, so the looks and the feel of the space battles are considerably better than on the ground. On the ground, it's just like every other RTS, only it just drags on and on. In space, you got ships that behave differently, everything has a special ability basically, now that exists on the ground as well, but it's considerably more interesting when you're doing it in a space battle, and you have this combination of capital ships with fighters and such like that all intermix and create something to really behold. On the ground, it's just a bunch of dudes shooting at a bunch of other dudes with some tanks and some walkers to compensate as well, that don't really do enough to really get you in the feel of the battle, quite like the space battle parts of it do. And you may think that the cinematic camera option can help you out here, but it's really just a visual tweak. It doesn't really actually add all that much to the game, other than just, hey, this looks slightly cooler when you go through the cinematic camera instead of just watching it as a real-time strategy game. The mechanics are still exactly the same no matter what you're doing, it's just that it's done with a different, more interesting camera style that kind of zooms in on the action. But on the ground, that's really not that interesting. In space, on the other hand, it looks a hell of a lot cooler. But it's just that. Looks. It looks cool, but it doesn't really add anything to the game. And if you take this thing as just a strategy game, it has a fair amount about it that is pretty unique. It has good presentation. It has reasonable gameplay mechanics. I mean, there's nothing really broken about it. There's nothing really outright bad about it. It's just that half the game, the land battles, are incredibly boring. They just drag on, and there's not enough real variety in the actual tactics to elevate it above anything beyond extremely average at best territory. And then you get to the space battles and you've got that grand spectacle going on that really does set it apart. So even though you do have special abilities for your units on the ground, you don't really care too much. This is really a pretty simple RTS when you get down to it. I mean, you do have some variety between the two factions, but ultimately the mechanics play out pretty much exactly the same, with just some very slight stat differences when you actually get into the battle portions. The main differences between the two play out on the campaign map rather than the actual battles. When you get into the actual battles, land combat is ludicrously boring, and space combat is really only saved by the fact that it's a sight to behold. It feels a lot more like Star Wars than the land battles do. And that highlights a pretty major problem. When you take this on its own, as a strategy game, it's just pretty average. if you take it as a Star Wars game, it gets the feel right in a lot of areas, namely in the space battles. But mechanically, it's still a fairly average RTS for the most part. It's unique, but in terms of its overall quality, its overall depth, it's just fairly average. And that's my main problem with it. More often than not, when I play Empire at War, I get bored of it pretty quickly, because I could play so many other RTSs that I just have a better time with. The only thing that really gravitates me toward Empire at War is the fact that it's a Star Wars strategy game. It's pretty unique. That's about it. I don't really have all that much fun with it. Again, it's not a bad game. You might be able to get something out of it, but I was able to get a hell of a lot more out of Galactic Battlegrounds than this, mostly because I enjoyed the living hell out of Age of Empires 2, and Galactic Battlegrounds is basically just if you take Age of Empires 2's gameplay and transplant it into Star Wars. And that gameplay is pretty much timeless at this point. Empire at War, on the other hand, doesn't really do anything to really draw you in other than the fact that it's a Star Wars strategy game. And it certainly doesn't do anything to really keep you there. If you're more of a hardcore RTS player, you're going to get less out of it than just a more casual RTS player. Someone like that will be able to look at this thing and go, oh, it's Star Wars, it's got space battles, those are really cool. And that'll be the end of it. But for someone like me who wants a bit more out of their RTSs, there's not really much here. But your mileage may vary there. I give it a 3 out of 5. Again, it's an okay game. It's worth checking out if it looks interesting to you, especially if you can get it on sale. But if you want something a bit more out of your RTSs than, oh my god, it's Star Wars, then you might want to look elsewhere. Thanks for watching.